Hello, sir. We can start now.
Okay. Okay, I can see Raj.
Hi, good morning.
Welcome, Raj. And
Both
Yeah.
the panelists have joined us.
yeah,
Hi, Sanju.
Sanusha Naidu. Am I pronouncing it correct? Yeah, you have to unmute, Sanusha.
Thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
you are. Good day, everyone.
Okay, welcome. I think we are going to start, and welcome to all the participants. They can see three of us, but we can't see them right now. I don't know whether the network strength would allow us to see them, but at some point, I would suggest that they also unmute their video. Our participants would have expected a more familiar face today as the moderator of today's session, my colleague Paddy. I had to come in because Paddy has some urgent engagement right now. So we will have 1.5 hours of presentation and discussion today, which is on the last objective, the last and final objective of the GCM. So today, after today, we would have covered all 23 objectives of the GCM. It has been a long journey since we started in September, touching on various areas of migration governance and diaspora engagement. And I need to thank our co-organizers. My name is Vinod Khadria. I am the president of the GRFDT, and our co-organizers are Cross-Regional Center for Refugee and Migrants, CCRM in short, the GRFDT, of course, Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, International Institute for Migration and Development, IIMAD, based in Trivandrum, Kerala, and Metropolis Asia Pacific, MAP. In addition, we have Migrant Forum in Asia, that is MFA. Today, we will be looking at the GCM number 23, which seeks to strengthen international cooperation and global partnership for safe, orderly, and regular migration. The commitment statement that we have, let me read it out to you. It's a long statement, so I will just read it verbatim. We commit to support each other in the realization of the objectives and commitments laid out in the Global Compact through enhanced international cooperation, a revitalized global partnership, and in the spirit of solidarity, reaffirming the centrality of a comprehensive and integrated approach to facilitate safe, orderly, and regular migration, and recognizing that we are all countries of origin, transit, and destination. We further commit to take joint action in addressing the challenges faced by each country to implement the compact, underscoring the specific challenges faced in particular by African countries, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, small island developing states, and middle income countries. We also commit to promote the mutually reinforcing nature between the Global Compact and existing international legal and policy frameworks by aligning the implementation of this Global Compact with such frameworks, particularly the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and the recognition that migration and sustainable development are multidimensional and interdependent. So the expression we represent the 193 countries who were signatories of this Global Compact Agreement. In fact, not 193, it was 192, because United States had opted out of this agreement before it was signed. We have an able panel to discuss today. Dr. Raz Bordali, former senior official at the United Nations, and also my colleague at GRFDT in the capacity of a vice president. Sanusha Naidu, senior foreign policy analyst, Institute for Global Dialogue. So I will invite them one by one, and I'll first invite Ms. Naidu, but let me tell you about her. And then I will invite you to speak for about 20 minutes, and then followed by introducing Raz Bordali, and then she will speak for 20 minutes, and then we will have question answers. So Sanusha Naidu is a foreign policy analyst. Her research interests include democratization in Africa, Africa's political economy and development, Africa's relations with emerging powers from the South, that is BRICS and IPSA, South African foreign policy analysis, and the role of Track 2 diplomacy in international relations. Ms. Naidu has a master's in international relations from the University of Staffordshire, UK. She has previously worked at the Center for Conflict Resolution based in Cape Town and managed the South African Foreign Policy Initiative, SAFPI for short, at the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. In the past several years, Ms. Naidu has also managed a program that focused on Africa's international relations with China and emerging powers based at Pahamu from 2008 to 2010. She has an extensive publications record, which include many edited volumes on Africa-China relations, Chinese and African perspective on China and Africa. And then we have a number of jointly edited books and other publications. She has been a regular speaker at the news agencies, including Al Jazeera News, CCTV, BBC Radio, SABC, and CBS Africa. She is also a regular analyst on South Africa's domestic politics and electoral trends. So, Ms. Sanusha will be speaking today on this aspect of global cooperation, which is objective number 23 of the GCM. And then we'll have some questions to follow up with.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. To my fellow colleagues on the panel, good day. To participants on the platform, good day for wherever you are. Please excuse me if there's any background noise. I'm just not at home at the moment. I'm traveling, so whatever it is, just let me know if I'm clear, audible, and so forth. Firstly, let me thank Paddy and in particular the organizers for reaching out to me. I know it's been a bit of short notice on both sides, but I think this discussion cannot come at a more timely perspective or a timely event in our global architecture around what does global cooperation mean in the context of safe, secure migration, orderly migration. And I think the visions and the images we are seeing across our television screens and in terms of what is the humanitarian crisis that we are witnessing today, right now, that we thought would not be possible, would be unfathomable and unconscionable, has now gripped us in terms of what does this mean for Agenda 2030, excuse me, but also for the Global Compact and the Global Compact on Migration in terms of Cooperation 23 and in terms of global cooperation. I want to start off with a few preface my comments today and raise the question around what are we looking at a realistic interpretation of the compact right now in the context of cooperation globally.
Voice is breaking now.
Can you hear me now?
Your network is not good. It's breaking.
Is it breaking? Oh, I'm so sorry. It's a lot of traffic happening wherever I am now.
But we are hearing it correctly here. It's okay here. It's not breaking.
Or if you would like to, we
hear too.
can switch off our videos, perhaps, if that helps.
I can hear.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
You can hear?
I can
Okay,
hear.
go ahead.
Yeah,
please.
I can hear loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So
Yeah.
I think the starting point for this conversation and this interaction is really around what is the nature of the current dynamics and the structural conditions for global cooperation around the spirit of solidarity around migration, safe, secure, and enabling for these humanitarian corridors to exist. Right now, what we are beginning to see in terms of not just safe, orderly, and regular in terms of migration, I think we're also beginning to realize that countries are pushing back on migration. So as much as there's a global compact on cooperation in terms of enabling migration to happen, enabling countries that are signatories to the compact, the global compact, they're also very much aligned to their national interest. And in the case of South Africa, I think what's interesting for us is we're grappling right now with the question of the idea that we have a paper on migration that has just been issued by the Department of Labor. And part of the challenge is how do we actually attend to our borders that have become very porous, but also our commitments to global international protocol, like the commitment to the UN, the refugee protocol, like to questions around people who have basically been displaced, and how do we deal with displaced individuals who are coming out of conflicts, and more importantly, need the kind of engagement that we provide in terms of our protocols around international architecture in terms of agreements. The problem right now, I think, is the entire international architecture is in a state of fragmentation. And because it's in a state of fragmentation, it is also being pushed in terms of where are the resources going to come from. One of the challenges we are finding in South Africa is the question of dealing with economic migrants that are coming into our border and how they are being treated in the context of either they are coming in to look for jobs or they're coming in terms of economic opportunities, but there's a reaction to them at the domestic level. So for me, what is very critical about the global compact and global cooperation is that the paper that we use to sign these agreements, the signatory obligations we have to international law, to legal frameworks, to the fact that we are committed to the SDGs, it does not necessarily always resonate at the domestic level in terms of practice, in terms of action. And what we do see invariably in South Africa, I'll use South Africa more as an example, is what happens at the border also reflects what happens behind the border. Very often what happens at the border is a reflection of reactions to migrants that are coming into South Africa in terms of taking away our jobs. There's not enough opportunity. They are bringing in criminal elements, etc., and so forth. So the idea of safe, orderly, and regular migration is juxtaposed by the fact that there's impressions and perceptions of the other, of what the foreigner is, who the foreigner is, and what the foreigner entails. Very often in South Africa, when we see a whole lot of issues emerge around economic migration, etc., there's a sense of negative reaction, both in the media, but also, not all media, some media, but also there's very nationalistic tendencies towards migrants or in terms of migrating communities. And right now, those perceptions are fueled by the fact that we tend to look at economic migrants or refugees or displaced people as eating up our own resources. And so the national interest and the national economic interest and the national political interest and the security interest all dovetails into this dynamic. So that's at a very micro level. I use the example of South Africa. And of course, in terms of opposition politics, it also gives rise to the kind of populism we see. We see that populism in Europe, but we also see this populism in parts of South Africa, a reaction to the fact that low-skilled jobs are being filled by foreigners. And how do we prevent that from happening? Because South Africa has a high unemployment rate. So there's this juxtaposition between what our commitment is at the international level to what is our implementation at the micro level. We even had certain officials in opposition parties using the economic migrant argument to say that South Africa needs to revisit its global compacts. It needs to revisit its commitment because it needs to basically take care of South Africans who don't have jobs before anyone else. And that kind of global compact, I think, also resonates to what the regional dynamic is around economic migration, the safe migration of people, the orderly migration of people, and the secure migration of people. The Southern African region does have conflict. Mozambique, there's a number of displaced people that are emerging out of the conflict in the southern part, in the northern part of Mozambique. There's also people that are moving away because there's not enough economic opportunity. Landlocked countries, for example, where the economies are rather small. Their purchasing power parity doesn't necessarily allow them to have the kind of engagement around these economic opportunities. So they look towards South Africa, and there's this very temperamental relationship that the South African government has with both how it reacts to issues of tension between foreigners and locals, but it also doesn't have a cohesive response. And then, of course, in communities where the violence becomes really palatable. So right now in South Africa, there is a major set of tensions happening out in Gauteng with the local community and a foreign community. And this is migrants, not just from South Africa, from within the African region in terms of Southern Africa. These are also migrants coming in from the Horn of Africa, migrants coming in from Asia, South Asia in particular. There's an interesting reaction to the way we understand these global compacts. The further afield we go to the continent, I think there's a serious not dilemma, but there's definitely a serious reflection that needs to be had is there an AU policy on this, the African Union? How does the African Union define and devise and implement, if possible, a migration policy that allocates the alignment with the global compact, with the whole question of global cooperation? I think regions between Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa, etc., there are displaced people who have been fleeing conflict. For example, one of the biggest challenges, I think, in East Africa is the closing down of the refugee or the biggest refugee camp in Kenya. There's also the question of the internal displacement and what's happening with migration between the Tigray region and Ethiopia. And that challenge, that internal dynamic, raises questions of resources, it raises questions of capabilities, but it also raises questions of when a country signs up to a global compact, the question is, does it only apply to your border areas or does it apply regionally as well for internal displaced people born out of intrastate conflict? And that is what Mary Caldo at the LSE talks a lot about. She talks about the new types of conflict that have emerged, but it's not just interstate anymore, it's intrastate. And what happens with intrastate conflict? The second point I want to make is linked to this intrastate conflict is human security dilemmas, peace and security interventions, but also displaced people who are moving away from different conflicts that are born out of whether you talk about the African Renaissance dam conflict, displacement of building a dam, how that creates displacement of people, the migration issues there. But more importantly, I think the bigger challenges are not just about new threats to human security born out of water and water access, etc., but climate change. How does climate change, climate adaptation, climate refugees become a key point for this discussion on the global compact? So the global compact, I think, of cooperation is very important as a big international architecture. But when we start to peel away the layers and we start to disaggregate it in terms of whether countries have domesticated the compact into their national legal frameworks, we then see levels of disconnect. And those levels of disconnect that we are talking about is essentially levels of disconnect in terms of what are the tensions on the ground between communities that are basically moving into societies that are based on migration, or communities that are saying, we don't want foreigners in our country. And that for me is a very, very big question. Linked to this question of and I'll come back to climate change, because I think climate change has a very, very important dynamic to where we are now. Where I think we have to be very, very clear is the role of international institutions, governance institutions. And I'm hoping that Dr. Raj will explore and expand on this much more, given her expertise in this area. But one of the areas that I find very critical on the Global Migration Compact and the Partnership Compact and the question of Agenda 2030, but also in Africa, Agenda 2063, is the question of the responsibility to protect. What is the responsibility to protect? I think very often the responsibility to protect, as defined in the UN architecture and as noted by the previous special advisor to Secretary General Guterres, is that it is about the prevention of conflict, the prevention of undermining the human security architecture. When do we apply the R2P? Now, there's an interesting debate happening right now about the responsibility to protect, because the responsibility to protect is not just about a country talking to another country and saying, you have a responsibility to protect both domestically, but also in terms of refugees, in terms of secure, orderly migration and so forth. It's how do you protect people who are within your borders, who are non-nationals. And the challenge for R2P is the definition, and how do you expand that definition of responsibility to protect? When do you activate the responsibility to protect? In Africa, we have the African peer review mechanism, which is very much about a domestication of how the governance architecture is defined economically, politically, and socially. But in that APRM, I think we have to expand the definition to include the responsibility to protect migrants, the responsibility that you don't create displaced people, the responsibility to ensure that the partnership around the global cooperation is not just 192 countries that decide to affirm themselves, but it's about domesticating it, regionalizing it, and in the case of Africa, continentalizing it, because it has very real expressions around how we include different dynamics and different aspects of this. And this brings me to climate change. Climate refugees is one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in the forthcoming years. In the 21st century, we're going to have to deal not just with intrastate conflict, we've got to deal with environmental security threats. And environmental security threats are both man-made, but they are also linked to the fact that climate change is happening at a rapid pace. Rising sea levels, there are certain communities that basically will no longer exist. Desertification, people are being pushed inward. That's creating incredible pressure on the architecture of what we can provide in terms of food security. And most importantly, I think it's about the access to new forms of conflict, but would lead to more displaced individuals. And that is resource wars that are not just based on minerals in the ground, but in terms of the finite resources that exist up on the surface of our environment, and that is pollution, desertification, no access to water, food insecurity, new forms of diseases, new forms of pathogens that will emerge. And this means that the global cooperation is not just about war. The global cooperation has to be about the provision of how do we deal with climate change. The more we agitate, the more we engage in conflict born out of how it's about destabilizing the environment, the more we're putting ourselves at risk for more climate refugees to emerge. Are we prepared for it? No. Do we have the resources for it? Maybe. Do we know what we're going to do in terms of climate adaptation? I don't think so. Because I think that right now where we are is one of the key issues for me that I want to explore further in my own research is how much of the resources that are going to be used or committed to climate change, climate transition, adaptation, and the whole just transition debate is going to basically not be used for that and repurposed to deal with the current crisis we see happening in Europe. That there's going to be an incredible pressure of refugees. There's going to be we already see the refugees, the displaced people that are going to be moving out of, that have moved out of Ukraine, considering the situation there. What does this mean for the rest of the world? What does this mean for the rest of the global cooperation compact? I think in Africa, we have to think very seriously of how we have to find the resources and distribute those resources much more equitably, but to find the kind of sustainable engagement around trade, around communities. Right now, there are fishing villages that no longer can sustain themselves on the east coast of Africa. There's overfishing that's
Okay, you have
happening.
3 more minutes, please. 3 more minutes.
And there's overfishing happening in terms of what's going on in the Indian Ocean rim. And so there's a whole depletion of biodiversity, depletion of coral reefs, and depletion of what could be very important for the way in which we mitigate the risks of climate refugees. So I think in the last minute, Chair, with your indulgence, I just want to make sure that we understand that the layering effect from the global to the regional to the national is very important. And we've got to find the expressions where we actually domesticate this. And domesticating it doesn't mean that we just put it into a legal instrument and don't come back to it. We also have a lot of activists in South Africa, the region, and beyond in Africa who have become key drivers and advocates of climate refugee. And what does this mean for human security? I'll stop there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you for that very lucid presentation and highlighting the issues of conflict, particularly, and resource utilization, not only inter-regional, but intra-regional in the context of South Africa, and how it is connected with different regions of the world, particularly with even, South Asia that you mentioned. So we'll come back to you on this when perhaps you would like to also reflect on the relevance of all this in the context of the IMRF, which is going to take place in a month and a half, 1.5 months time in the month of May. So while you ponder over that, I would request our second speaker to come on board. But let me introduce our second speaker, Dr. Raj Bordele. She holds a PhD degree in economics with labor and employment focus. She has over 32 years of work experience in teaching and research in universities in the Caribbean and Africa regions, and as socioeconomist in the UNDP and senior economist in the UN organizations, including in the field like UN Economic Commission for Africa, and at headquarters in New York, where she focused on African development issues and challenges. Dr. Bordele's professional experience covers a wide range of socio-economic development issues in the Caribbean and Africa regions, including, among others, poverty reduction and sustainable development, labor and employment policies, technology and development, financing development through private and international resource mobilization, gender and development, migration and development. Since leaving active service, Dr. Bordele has committed her research on the nexus between migration and development. She has also pursued as an independent consultant and as an external research affiliate at York University's Center for Refugee Studies in Toronto, and as a visiting research fellow at the Institute for African Studies in Cornell Universities in the New York State. Dr. Bordele has a number of publications, which include books journal articles, monographs, and conference papers to her credit. She is not new to you. She has on many occasions given her reflections and shared, Q&As with you. So we are fortunate to have her, deliberate on this last objective number 23, which I would leave her to reflect upon, and then we can also request her to relate it with the IMRF, as I had mentioned to our earlier speaker. Raz, you have 20 minutes to speak.
In fact, thank you very much, Professor Kadria, for this generous introduction. I will actually take less than 20 minutes, okay? I think after listening to Ms. Naidu, she spells out the challenges. I think I want to focus on the objective 23, which I contend that is not an objective. In my view, objective 23 is actually a framework of implementing the rest of the objectives 1 to 22, because it's within the framework of cooperation and partnership. So I actually want to speak to that, what actually we mean by partnership, and that this is a very lofty objective in the sense that we can incorporate different partners and organizations into the implementation of the Global Compact. And Ms. Naidu mentioned that now the things are changing. There's a situation in Europe, and what would that mean in terms of the commitment made prior to this conflict in Europe? Well, not conflict, situation in Ukraine, to actually the implementation of because the priorities are changing. The firstly is the national issues. People need to address their own issues before they go into region or international issues. So I will speak to partnership and what it means in this context. And in fact, what are some of the challenges within this partnership? We talk about partnership as if it is mutually beneficial. Partnership is supposed to be mutually beneficial, and that's why we stay in partnership. And if it's not mutually beneficial, it's only one side, then it cannot be sustained. So the question I have in my mind is, partnership, it's mutually beneficial for the sending, receiving countries as well. Or whether it is lopsided because the receiving countries or the host countries are the ones who have the resources, and the sending countries, migrant sending countries, have to contend with what they get. And in the end, these resources are not even effectively used or utilized. Sorry, let me just turn off my phone. Excuse me, so we don't get disturbed. Okay, so what is partnership in this context and international cooperation and partnership? Partnership would involve, we have been in the game of international development for a very long time in the case of the Global South, particularly in Africa and some of the Asian countries. And we continue to depend on that. And what has the development assistance done? So if we continue to say we need more resources to effectively implement this, and this could be done through partnership and so on. So we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is this partnership? Is this partnership for both receiving countries and migrant sending countries? And how the partnerships have worked in the past. There have been mechanisms, there have been initiatives, there have been partnerships, perhaps not with the vision, whether they are one off, you say, okay, let's work on this, and then they are not followed up, there's no continuity, and there's no ownership. And in the end, the partnership becomes a partnership only for one side that supports that partnership. And because in implementing the Global Compact, there is need for resources, and there's no doubt, and it's clearly stated. And it is also obvious that these resources are likely to come from from developed countries from the global north. As regards the UN is concerned, or the multilateral organizations, they can provide technical support, or they can provide advisory services. They may fund here and there some small initiatives. But here we're talking about an issue which is basically it's the irregular migration that the global north is focused on. They're not worried about the regular migration because they need their skills, they need their expertise, and they need their contribution, both economic contribution in terms of taxes and so on. So their focus is on how to control the stem of irregular migration. And that until we tackle the drivers of migration, and Ms. Naidu has mentioned the environment, and I go more into the more critical driver of migration, which of course is poverty and uneven development in the countries that from where migrants are originating. So if that issue of uneven development and uneven relations is not addressed, it's like paying a lip service. So this is the complex is lofty, implementation is challenging, even though the mechanisms for implementing have been laid out. So what sort of partnership do we have in mind? Currently, the EU has a skills partnership. That means the people who have certain levels of skills, they are able to find regular pathways. But those who don't fit into that category, then they have to find some other means to get to the countries where there's demand for their labor. So it's not to say that the irregular workers are moving because they don't have any demand for their labor. There is. The challenge is, how do you convince your local population that we can import people who are semi-skilled, because nobody is unskilled, people have something to offer, and therefore how to get the support of their electorate to go for these things. So there are a whole lot of challenges. So when we come to this partnership, I would focus on 2 or 3 areas. Partnership in terms of recruitment versus practices. The recruitment of, in some countries where there is temporary migration, recruitment is done through recruitment agencies, and then of course there's a violation of their rights once they get to the host country. So I think this is an area where there's a lot of abuse of the rights of migrants, both in terms of the conditions of service, wages, as well as their treatment. So I think this is one area which needs to be looked into. And of course, the other area is the decent work and the decent conditions of service. How do we ensure that migrants who are going abroad or leaving their countries, they have decent work and the work is properly paid and their conditions of service are respected? And there's some protection of these. I mean, we have enough to talk about COVID, and we have done that. And that COVID, in fact, the pandemic has shown the treatment of migrants and temporary workers, and especially those in irregular status in this situation of the pandemic, that there is a violation of the human and labor rights. So these are some of these challenges. And in dealing with partnership, how do we measure the effect of that partnership? How effective are those partnerships? Who is responsible for monitoring to check whether these partnerships are actually working? Whether these partnerships fulfill the desired objectives, and whether there is ownership in these partnerships. In order for the partnerships to continue, there has to be ownership, and that means those who are supposed to be implementing should be adequately involved in this. And they have to be inclusive. And that inclusive doesn't mean that just is the government to government, but also those who will be implementing, both the civil society organizations, in some cases, private sector, as well. So it has to be the modalities for implementing the partnership need to be worked out. And whether these partnerships result in transformative results for migrants. In other words, we have partnership, but is it making a difference? Is it good for all the parties concerned, or is it good for some who can take the credit? So by giving money or some resources to countries where there are issues of irregular migration, for that matter, or where there is issue of a lot of people wanting to migrate. So providing resources means that they can look the other way and say, okay, we have given you enough money and you sort out your people now. You control them so they don't go helter-skelter. So I think in reality, there will be a lot of challenges as we go through implementing this. And the other thing is, what is the capacity at the national level where most of the implementation has to happen with the support of regional as well as international organizations and so on. To what extent the compact has been actually popularized or democratized at the ground level? Do ministries know our line ministries that are supposed to mainstream the 2030 agenda as well as some of the migration aspects into the development plans? Are they sufficiently capacitated? Do they have enough capacity resources to ensure that there is a greater understanding that each time, and they need to be looking out for where there is a violation of migrants' rights and so on. Do they have that sort of capacity? I think I have 5 more minutes, maybe 10 minutes, Professor Kadria?
Yeah,
Okay.
you have about 7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay. So let's just focus on expanding regular pathways or pathways for migrants, okay? I think in the COVID situation, certain initiatives were done, okay, where people who were stuck there, they were given temporary extension, or they were given, in some cases, humanitarian visas for them to continue to stay on. Portugal, and in some cases, other countries as well. Now, what happens now that if the situation stabilizes and people are able to return to their own countries, then are those initiatives going to still stay in action, or they're going to go back to that? So I think these are some of the areas we need to, and then maybe then they become irregular. Then what is going to happen? Okay, even if the labor is needed, apart from those who are in essential services such as health, agriculture or food production and so on. The others, then they have to go back. So what is the program for those returnees, those who are coming back? How are they reintegrated? What is the, what's the support they can mobilize in reintegrating them? And what sort of plans receiving countries, that means the countries of origin, have for these people who are sent back or who cannot stay on anymore and they become irregular, or their status become irregular? Are they prepared for this? And would there be partnerships in those? So I think we need to do quite a bit of soul searching as well as research studies to see how these partnerships are actually working on the ground and where the weaknesses are and how these partnerships can be strengthened, and whether they are being mainstreamed into the various implementing organs or agencies and so on. So I have mentioned that the people, regularization, raising more or increasing more regular pathways, and at the same time also providing decent work and conditions of service, areas of recruitment, and this is a notorious area, and we all know how smuggling happens and how irregular entries happen into countries, not only in the global north, but also countries, middle-income countries. And the protection of migrants continues to be a major challenge And we can't look the other way and say, yes, we have orderly, safe, and safe migration. And this will happen only when there's no need to migrate, when migration becomes a choice and not a necessity. And I mean, I can't see myself in a situation where we will have people who will say, okay, you know what, I think I just want to go and come back. Wish we could. We could turn the countries in the global south around and see how their development paradigms change and how they can make use of the resources they have to contain. No, I mean, we're not containing mobility because people will be mobile, they will be migrating. And I here bring in the question of what is happening in the Caribbean. Okay, we have the regional organization and sub-regional organization, which is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. Within this, I mean, they are particularly at the same low level of development. So the mobility is free, as well as work is free. You can work, you don't need a visa in this. And when we have, I mean, the Caribbean is known for hurricanes and certain other natural disasters and so on. So when we had in Dominica, where I come from, we had a hurricane, a very bad one, bad ones for that matter, in 2017. And those who could afford, they just took the boat and went to the next island. And there was no issue because, you know, there's an agreement between the countries in this organization. And we lost like almost 40% of the population to other islands, neighboring islands. And most of them have not come back because their property was destroyed and so on. They had to reset. They had to start all over again. Luckily, you know, if you have relatives or friends, it's the resettlement is easier. So the point I'm making here is that when you have these kind of disasters, and even if you have a place where you can go to and start your life all over, this actually puts you behind, and this doesn't help in achieving the goals of Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. So the challenges are ongoing. They will continue, and we cannot say, yes, if we address poverty, then all the other challenges will be subsumed. Challenges will continue. How do we prepare, and how do we actually provide? What sort of foresight is there in the countries everywhere? How did Poland prepare now to have so many millions and millions of refugees who are coming from Ukraine, the capacities. So how do we prepare for these unforeseen disasters and conflicts? And due to poverty, people are going to move because, you know, they need survival. So how do we create conditions in the countries of origin whereby all these challenges are foreseen and prepared? There is preparedness, whether it is preparedness to respond to those challenges or preparedness to mobilize resources, whether they are from outside or from the region, to see what do we do, how do we handle that? Is that preparedness a priority? Does that become a priority, or is this preparedness when the crisis comes? And we know too well what happened during the pandemic time, that it just suddenly came and there was no preparedness. So in the end, who is suffering? Migrants and their families. And I mean, they're suffering, unnecessary suffering that could have been avoided if there was good planning and so on. So is there going to be global cooperation in this, in managing? Because this is global governance through the lens of global cooperation and partnership. And whether this can be achieved or whether it is, and I think the review, where there have been regional reviews on this, what sort of progress has been made, and there will be, as we know, in May, in a couple of months, there will be the International Migration Review Forum is going to meet, whereby, and I don't know, apart from saying countries saying we have done this, we have done that, how are we going to assess the impact of those actions actually on the ground? What difference has it made? Has it made the lives of migrants transformative, or has it improved their lives, or are they still in the same situation. So I think a lot of research needs to be done in these areas, and civil society as well as academicians and researchers have a challenge in front of them to see how do we prepare ourselves to show the results of interventions. And it's not just on paper, but we want to see how it has worked. Is it working? Is it working for all? Because migration is supposed to be working for all and not for some, and not temporarily. And this migration is also to lead you to a quality of life which can be sustained. So people don't come in and out of the trap of going back or circular migration. I think I'll stop here and I'll see if there are any questions, because unfortunately I have to leave in the next 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rajbardle. If you have to leave in 10 minutes, I think we will, well, I think there are some questions, and I would request the participants to ask the question, to speak out and raise the hand. Nagoji, I can see your question, two questions, I think, one to Dr. Raj and one to our Ms. Naidu. So maybe you can, I give you 5 minutes to speak on this. Can you unmute yourself? Ngozi? Louis? Can you not hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm trying to unmute it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, good day all. Like I've just posted.
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Raj, thank you for your presentation. You've been in the Global South, the so-called Global South. People like you, we call them, we can say, you've been a mother to us in this program. But that's by the way. You've used the Objective 23 to connect all the objectives. Now, what roles can migrants play to ensure that their migration cycle becomes or remain regular and orderly, so that they don't get hurt, so that you don't have missing migrants, so that at the border they are not molested and all that. And Mrs. Naidu or Dr. Naidu, I don't know. How can AU partner with the international community in the issue of international arms deal? Because this creates, when we talk about Objective 2, that is drivers of the root causes of irregular migration. The international arms deal is there. So how can AU partner with international community, issue international arms deal to stop or reduce the sales of arms deal that create this situation in Africa? Because when people fight with stones and sticks, you don't create a displacement situation. Those won't few people and the situation of when B-52 is fly, F-23 applied, many people killed and the situation is fairly still.
Okay. Since Dr. Rajbardle has to leave, I will ask Joan, Gloria, and Richard Obedi to direct your questions to her first, and then we can take up the questions to Ms. Naidu later on. Joan, Gloria?
Yes, thank you so much, our facilitator, and thank you so much, our moderators. My name is Joanne from Kenya. I have this question. Now, do we categorize these agreements like the bilateral labor agreements and the multilateral labor agreements as part of the international corporations? And if so, what are the consequences, or who is supposed to be held liable if in case they are not followed to the latter, or they are not implemented by the countries? For instance, the destination countries, they are not implementing what they signed together with a country that is a source country. Yeah, that is what I would wish to know. Thank you.
Okay, I will collect the questions for Raz Bordle. Richard Obedi.
Yes, thank you, moderator. My name is Richard Obedi. I work as the executive director of the Populous Foundation International. We are based in Uganda, but we work in the region, in the EAC, in the Great Lakes region. Yes, thank you, Madam Raj, for those elaborate presentations. Yeah, you mentioned something to do with global governance, and you underscored really what we are supposed to do as stakeholders. And I see that the war in Russia, I know it has biblical connotations, but then that war in Russia and between Russia and Ukraine, this actually it's a betrayal of the global compact on migration. And what can the global leaders do to really bring that war to an end? And then, moderator, let me just also send my regards to Naidu for the wonderful presentation also she made, and she tackled issues of internal displacement. Actually, that is the phenomenon that is happening. And my disappointment with AU is that most of these instruments, most of these legal and political instruments of the AU, they're just in the corridors of Addis Ababa or wherever the headquarters of those programs are. Look at the latest AU framework, the African Continental Free Trade. They don't actually translate to the situation on the ground. Madam Naidu mentioned something to do with the policy, what we call migration policy framework for Africa. When you look at the level of ratification, it's so miserable. I think there are only three countries that ratified or that deposited their instrument back to the AU headquarters. And out of all the 55 or 54, whatever member states, just look at that level of unseriousness. And with all these dynamics that are happening on migration-related issues, yet they're not even doing anything. And that's my big disappointment with the AU and some of these intergovernmental bodies. Thank you.
Thank you. Raj, before you leave, you have 5 minutes to respond and anything else that you'd like to say as your last thoughts before you leave. You have to unmute, Raj. Please unmute. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
One of the questions was the treatment of migrants at the border, how they are treated. How they're treated is very much influenced by what the general population's attitude towards migrants is. In other words, people who have power, they will use it because they are supposed to control the inflow of people who are not coming regularly. But that does not mean that they should treat them badly, that there is some protocol that they need to follow. But it's very difficult for me to say what they can do. And this has happened because it's the power. They use the power and they mistreat people. And there's no recourse. And that's a very sad thing, the treatment of migrants at the border. I can give you the example of even in the Caribbean, okay? In the CARICOM, countries that are member of the community, the CARICOM is the Caribbean community, there is free mobility from between the countries who are members, okay? So you can go from one country to the other. You don't need any visa to enter, but you cannot work. So when you are going there and they just suspect, the immigration officer just looks at you and say, okay, all right, I think he looks light. So they start to give you a hard time and you're sent back because it is at the discretion of the immigration officer to admit you or not. So even though there's free entry, they can, and there should be no reason. But even within that, they will exercise their power. As regards Joanne's question on the multilateral and bilateral cooperation agreements, So what happens when these agreements are not honored? And who's liable? What do we do with that? Well, it depends. You see, if it's a legal, if it's a partnership agreement and it's not legally binding, then, you know, it's easy to opt out. And I mean, the compact is the same. Compact is not legally binding. So you may have an agreement to do X, Y, Z, and in the end, it just doesn't happen. So I can't tell you how they can take this forward as if it's a legal thing. And then, of course, they can take the legal recourse and countries can put pressure. If, for example, the treatment of migrants in certain countries is pretty pathetic. And what's the role of the sending countries in ensuring that their nationals are protected when they go abroad to help those countries? So whether we can legally hold them accountable, there's a long procedures to show whether there's evidence or not. So I think I cannot get into that. As regards global governance, the question is the compact failing? How do we justify, how can the war in Ukraine end? I mean, I can't tell you how it can end except through moral persuasion. You know, what countries can do is through moral persuasion, because they cannot use, NATO cannot use, NATO members cannot send soldiers or people on the ground to fight, to support Ukraine. The only way they do is now they have sanctions. I mean, these are some of the, and you see, the sad thing is that this thing is not even going through the Security Council because Russia has a veto. So even when you discuss and condemn and so on, so what? Okay. It was condemned, the invasion was condemned in the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly. A few countries just abstained or they were neutral, and you know who they were because of their personal interests or whatever the reason may be. So the rest is through moral persuasion. And this is what the president of Ukraine is doing. He's just going on these calls, he's going on the media to appeal to different countries how they can mobilize support from these countries to handle this. And this is a loss. Unfortunately, it's a very, very sad development or unfortunate development that while we are talking about this and then we are actually increasing more, we are getting, you know, we are seeing more refugees, and the plight of people is just, is heartbreaking. We all know that, and this is very sad. And in that, against that background, how would the review be affected? How will we see the review against this backdrop? What is happening? And we don't know in the next couple of months what's going to happen, if the war will stop and what will be the consequences and how they will be, how will the priorities shift, you know? How will the priorities and concerns shift rather than the review? So I think this will change, and it's very unfortunate. The only thing we can do is to pray and see that that Russia comes to its senses, which is, you know, it's a political thing. It's again a power game. So I would like to be excused if there's no serious question that cannot be answered, and if you want to reach me. And I want to thank Ms. Naidu for an insightful presentation and reinforcing on certain challenges that are critical, not only in the African situation, but in many developing countries. This is what is happening. So whether we will have a winning game in terms of having a transformation in the plight and conditions of migrants, it's a goal. And when we achieve that goal, that means all partners have to get together, civil society organizations, research needs to be done. And so I think I will stop here, and I apologize for not being here for the next half hour. I have some urgent call.
Well, on behalf of all of us, I thank Dr. Raj Bordoloi, but her message is true that this is a holistic objective which incorporates all other objectives. It's actually the operational objective in terms of making all other objectives work. You know, without the partnership most of the objectives would become dysfunctional. So that I think we have to keep in mind. With that, I thank you, Dr. Raz. So we will perhaps meet again, because there is going to be another session next Tuesday. So if you are free to join us, you will be welcome again. With this,
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Kadria, for moderating, and thank you for the participants for sitting in. And right now, my brain is elsewhere because, anyway, something is happening, so I need to focus on that. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raj.
Thank you. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I will turn to Ms. Naidu now. You already have, a couple of questions in your hand. So maybe we can begin with that, and then I will invite others who can ask subsequent questions. I think I can see Grace, Princessa, and Anity there, so we can continue with the conversation once you have addressed the earlier questions, Ms. Naidu.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to always listen to Dr. Raj. It's a pity I couldn't convey my thanks, but I think she really reinforced a lot of the points that I made around, the essence and the conceptualization of partnership. To the question around the silencing of the guns, and I think it's a very important question, because when we talk about Agenda 2063, I think we talk about that as a key focus around silencing of the guns. Silencing of the guns is not a literal interpretation of what we mean. I think silencing of the guns is very much a partnership within Africa, amongst African countries, within the AU, around the protocols, which Richard had essentially really eloquently laid out for us in terms of what is the value proposition around not just domesticating, but actually ratifying migration policy in the region. And I want to come back to that point around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and migration, because I think it's a very significant point around movement of people, not just movement of people because they're displaced or refugees, but movement of people because they are economic migrants. They do cross-border trade. Goods do not move without people in Africa. And I think it's a very important point to raise in terms of what is the rationalization of countries ratifying the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but not necessarily reconciling that with their national policy on migration or the way they deal with migration at the border level. I think it was Joan that asked the question about what do you do at the border level when you're going through crossing a border, which is a customs border. People are moving goods and they buying from one country and they're moving to the other. In South Africa, our borders just don't have that kind of understanding that we are signatories to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but our border policy and our border management agencies are still very much sitting in that kind of architecture where people are looking at it in terms of how do you keep people out. And I think that for me is important in terms of the question of Agenda 2063. Silencing of the guns is supposed to be the idea of stopping conflict in the continent. Now, at a very basic level, we haven't met that goal right now. It was supposed to have been met in 2020. We haven't met that goal. But I think silencing of the guns also means, and there was a point that was raised around arms sales into Africa, arms sales amongst African states, and arms that proliferate into the continent. Very clear for me is one of the extrapolations that I see in the current situation in Europe between Ukraine and what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but the sanctions I think has created an unprecedented moment for us, because what the sanctions has done is that it's shown that companies, when pushed, can stop doing business with a regime that they consider that they no longer want to do business with. And I think it's the same thing with arms deals. Arms that come into the continent based on companies that are selling arms, or whoever is selling the arms into Africa, who are the governments that are buying it, the proliferation of those arms across regions, across the different spaces in the African context, from East Africa to Southern Africa and up into West Africa, drug trafficking linked to arms sales, etc. we actually have to start thinking about where these gaps need to be addressed. We can't keep talking the rhetoric. We've got to find that traction in terms of making the commitment and carrying the commitment out pragmatically and in terms of action, operationalizing it. And I think that for me is critical, because we can now start putting that pressure, but it has to be governments that are willing to do so. And I want to stop there, because I think there's a few other things that perhaps I could bring in with other discussions and points made by colleagues on the platform.
Yes. Yeah. Grace, would you like to speak?
Yeah, thank you, of course, to Dr. Raj and Ms. Naidu. As a practitioner, although I'm a retired ambassador twice over, both in Abu Dhabi and the Vatican. Listening to all of this, I was just mulling over how, because I think last week I spoke on migrant empowerment and agency. Of course, from the origin, local, and also the governance, all the way to recruitment and to the destination country. So the ideal, of course, is migration by choice. And Luis was it Luis or Dr. Raz? The drivers. Maybe if you can mitigate a bit of the drivers, and this is what I've been telling our Filipina household service workers when I was ambassador in UAE, to try to stay, if they can, with the good governance and also the remittances to be used for development, like in the origin communities where our household service workers come, so that at least we can, I said, we can negotiate a bit for the bilateral labor agreements. I think everything in life is about relationships. It's about accepting our humanity. And again, as I was telling the ambassador, the Bangladesh ambassador to Jordan, my dream is to really, for us migrants, for the migrants, I have 2 children who are migrants, is to really be able to empower ourselves and try to be together in trying to project to the destination countries, hey, you need us. Actually, you need us. Your money cannot take care of your elderly, of your children. When push comes to shove, really, you need us more than we need your money. So if the drivers are lessened, there's more of a negotiating relationship between the two. So that's, in my case, I'm trying to start something here in the Philippines, a multi-sectoral approach between the faith-based, our local government, from everything that I've learned, studying theoretically, and as Dr. Binood said, to be an activist academician. Know some of the theories, some of this that we have learned, and apply it on the ground from the origin. And I'm really excited, Dr. Binood, to maybe come up with something and present it to the internet. But it's the migrant empowerment, I think, for us to understand where we're going to, especially for our women. So I hope to have a very deep pre-migration, not just pre-departure, pre-migration already. Even if you're not thinking of migrating, understand what's out there. And then, of course, the Philippines is a very, somehow, as Dr. Binood says, we're trying to protect our migrants. So the pre-departure, the recruitment process, of course, then the post-arrival, the on-site, and then the reintegration. That's, again, one of my projects. So in all of this, I think if we can really show to the countries of destination, and I did that in UAE, actually, in one of the countries that I was trying to not blink. It was a blinkmanship. You need us more than and they did blink. They did blink. After so many years, they now recognize household service. So I think it's a kind of empowering of the migrants themselves to know that, hey, what you're doing is really important. But if we can just hold on a bit, and that's where governance comes in. That's where the lessening of the drivers come in. And that's where the remittances for development come in. If they can stay the equivalent of $300 because they're going out for $400, I think if they understand it, and then we do the bilateral agreements that are binding, not just, you know what I'm saying, Dr. Binood, binding, like what we do with some countries who abuse our women. Okay, we won't send. And they say, okay, send them here. And then we will do this. Something of that level that they just accept and recognize the human rights and the dignity of our migrants. That's where I'm at. So the international, of course, the GCM, I wasn't really part of the whole process, Dr. Binod. I was just heard from the beginning. But I really hope that during the IMRF in May, I hope to be listening also, that all of these things are realized, but the countries of origin, this is where we coordinate regionally. The origin countries, good practices, this is, and the destination also, that they realize the importance, especially the COVID-19, who are in the frontliners, our Filipino nurses and doctors, the other workers. And yet they still think, hey, no, you need our dollars, you need our funds. Wait. So I think migrant empowerment and good governance and the recruitment, and then facing like, it's still uneven, the global South and the global North. But if we can just pinch them a bit to understand that we're all human beings in this planet, and we just have to respect each other, and that we need each other at the end of it. Thank you, Dr. Binod.
Thank you, Grace, for sharing your thoughts on this. I'm sure Ms. Naidu would have something to respond to this, but maybe I would first invite Sheku Bangura to say something. Yeah, you have to lower your camera so that we can see you properly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say something here. I'm so excited about it. And really, very much interested to be part of this forum here and to give my voice. And I'm very much excited about it. And really, when we talk about the global compact of migrations, it has to do with people who are migrants, and it has to do with the welfare of returning migrants. If we are to combat irregular migrations, it means we have to pay more attention to those who return back. But if we don't pay attention to those who return back, compacting the global migration, it will not take place. Because when those people return back to their own countries, they take them as not lesser people. They don't consider them as important people in society. They discriminated them to the highest degree. Those people would prefer, oh, let me go back where I am from. So on that sense, the chain of irregular migration, or the principle to compact global compact migration, it will not work. So on the sense, I'll just try to make a suggestion or recommendations here that whenever people travel from one place to another, not that they don't have something to do, not that they are hiding, or not that they just feel like moving. Maybe it's just because the situation in which they find themselves into their country of origin is not favorable for them. That's why they take up the move. So, oh, being that I'm not employed in my country, let me move whatever condition it is. So some of them move, take the risk. And whenever we talk about irregular migrations, it means those are migrants that has no documentation, they just move because the situation in their country warrants them to move. That is why they take up that risk. And the other areas again, some people apply several times for them to go out there to go and make a better life, but the consular system ignore them. So the profiling is also another issue. Someone has all the requirements for him or her to go and try himself to another country because the country of its origin is not favoring him or her. But applying several times and deny you several times, it also warrants you to take up irregular way. So that's another factor again, because we should be looking carefully why people move from one place to another. There are lots of factors which I will not be able to name here because of time. But in summary, these are some of the factors that propel irregular migration and also even regular way for people to move. So if people find themselves to their country, no matter how their migration status is, they must be treated and given the basic human rights principles, wherein they should be protected. But I find myself and see people languishing, more especially to the Asian countries, where we have these Kadama visas. When we talk about Kadama visas, we have this visa 20. Kadama means slave visa. You know, they work subjected as slavery, work without payment. Working without payment for several times, then as a result, they end up run away from their masters or madams. And once they run away, police capture them, they end up in prison, and later deported them to their country of origin. Get back to their country of origin, they have no place to sleep. My organization here, I treat such people like that. I register them and I ask them several questions. Why? And they give me this background. Oh, I left to my madam because I served her for several years. They don't pay me, I work as a slave. And because of that, I am tired and I ran away. And the visa which I have, it only allows me to stay where I am working. And once I use the street, that's why I was arrested and they changed to prison. And later, I got amnesty and then they deported me to my country. So this is my situation. And when I come back home, there is another challenge. The family rejected me because they thought I should bring something because I went out there to bring something. And once I come back home without nothing, the family rejected me. And later, they tagged them as fast. When they were in that part of the world, they said, oh, some of them, they are doing this, they are doing that. And that make their relative and family ignore them. And those are the people I bring into my office, cater for them, going helter and skelter and try to give them the basic needs that they require, etc. Provide feeding food for them. Then later, I do mediation and psychological counseling. From there,
okay,
I do
thank
mediation
you,
with the family,
Sheku.
bring the family together.
I think we are running out of time, Sheku. I have to interrupt now. I think we are running out of time. Thank you for your intervention. I think Ngozi has also made some comment on your observations. So we have people who think alike. I would have to now look at the clock and hand it over to Ms. Naidu for addressing the last questions and her final observations.
Thank you very much, Chair. I mean, I think the points raised in the last set of comments, questions, and issues that we need to ventilate in this conversation, and also the discussion that's had at the global level, but also in the continent and also within the broader global south is very important. I cannot agree more on the issue of perception. I think the issue of perception is critical for those that are migrating or forced to migrate, or for whatever reason, people go to another country. And I think this is what Dr. Raj made very importantly in terms of the space that she was talking about. And that was the question of people don't do it out of choice. They do it because there's some kind of factor or factors that are both conditions that they cannot exist in, or they need to move because it is about taking care of their families. And I think the remittance, apologies for the sun, but I think the remittance issue has been such a big issue that has actually had spiraling, snowballing effects on communities, on families, especially when COVID became such a challenge to the global economy and to the migration of people. The other point to make here is the challenge around reintegration of people who want to go back home. I don't think migrants in many ways see themselves staying in a particular space to become permanent residents. Yes, they may get permanent residency, but there is, especially in Southern Africa, there's a need for people to go back home. There's a need that they want to go back home. But when going back home, there's also the challenge of whether they are reintegrating into the same society. And what is the perception, as Shekhar rightly pointed out, of people returning? And especially those that are at the lower end of the economic ladder, migrants that are coming back in terms of the skills they may have and how they put it back into the system in terms of development. And I think in terms of countries that are host countries to migrants, I think the perceptions there as well need to be interrogated further, that the perceptions we have of the other is very much the work that I like of Edward Said, who talks about the other and otherness. And I think very much in terms of the global compact and the migration issues, I was very struck, Dr. Kadaria, about the fact that you said of 193 countries, only 192 signed the global compact. And the country that didn't sign it was the USA. And again, we see this kind of duality when it comes to the global governance arena, when it comes to institutions, that where everybody talks the talk, but don't want to actually get engaged in it. And I think that for me is where the issue of the provisions of the global commons is so important. I think people move, it's inherently within us to migrate, to move. We all in some way or form move in whether it's internal, whether it's external. But I think we have to start remapping and reorientating the narrative of the global compact on migration. It's not that people are coming in to take your jobs. It's like Dr. Raj said, there's a hierarchy. There's the ones that are considered regular migrants and the ones that are considered irregular migrants. And I think the irregular migrants are considered to be just there to play a particular role. And once it's done, you need to move away. And I think what we're currently going to see is, particularly on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, is a serious need for African governments, for practitioners and policymakers to start aligning the macro interpretation of the Continental Free Trade Agreement to the micro practicalities, because at this moment in time, it's not synchronizing. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Naidu, for wrapping it up so nicely with addressing these practical questions. If there is a burning last question, I would still allow it. But if not, then in 2 seconds, I'm going to just wrap it up. I think it has been a fantastic session. The last session on the last objective, partnership and collaboration. Now, it's easier said than done. The partnership is a very tricky issue, and at what level? The partnership between countries, between international organizations, across different levels, within countries, intra-regional, inter-regional, all those issues are important. And at the micro level, within the family, across the families, the partnership is important everywhere in the context of migration. But I think what is challenging is the multilateral negotiations. Now, multilateral negotiations is a globally coveted, and over-glorified exercise. Grace is here, who must have taken part in, as an ambassador, she must have taken part in many of the multilateral negotiations. And she bear me out when I say that, this is something which is more of a show than actually meaning business. The South countries get hardly any time to flag their issues. They get half a minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. And what happens to that at the end? I have myself been the witness as a thematic expert in the second round, in the second thematic debate on drivers of migration in 2017 at New York in the United Nations. And I had to listen to all the entire deliberation over 2 days and sum it up and made my own recommendations. And I said that a lot of it, the deliberations that went on for 1.5 days, that was a lot of it was basically, old wine in new bottle. But I said the old wine is needed because old wine is much more tastier than the new wine. So we have to preserve and use it again. There was a lot of reinvention of wheel. I said that's also needed because we have to keep reminding ourselves what we need to do, what we need to understand. But ultimately, what matters is the innovative ideas. And there was a dearth of innovative ideas. even if there are 1 or 2 or 3 of them, the innovative ideas are actually lost in the din of that, massive multilateral negotiations. What is needed? In fact, the Secretary General, Secretary General, earlier one had recommended mini multilateralism, and that I think is absolutely important to happen. Partnership to turn into partnership, to translate into partnership at regional level or intra-regional level, and so on. I have given it a new name. I called it equitable adversary analysis. Why South Asia, for example, where I come from, the SAARC countries cannot get together, whereas the Southeast Asian ASEAN can get together and move ahead. That's because we do not analyze each other's needs. We all the time are only as competitors. And I think what is needed is that we step into each other's shoes, try to look at each other's problems with empathy. That's why equitable adversary analysis needs to be taken into account. And that exercise you don't do. We just go straight into multilateral negotiations and then come up with lofty ideas and with empty bags, nothing to implement. And I think the IMRF, I hope that IMRF is not a repetition of that, and it is something more than that. It means business. That I think is absolutely necessary. And that's where I think bilateral negotiations are much more important. And if bilateral negotiations do not take us further, then perhaps we need leaders. We need champion countries. We need single countries taking unilateral positions and bravely facing the world. And if you don't come with me, I'll walk alone. That kind of courage has to be shown. That I think is absolutely important for partnership to fructify into actual reality. That's why we need to lay down the pathways to partnership, whether it is within the African continent or between Africa and Asia, and between Africa, Asia and Latin America, the South, entire South. Or I think what is important in Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, which is different from is that the global South and the global North are equal partners. The Millennium Development Goal was not, it was only a consortium of South countries. The onus was only on South countries, whereas Sustainable Development Goal, the onus is on both global North and global South countries. We have to keep that in mind. And we also have to keep in mind that there are wheels within wheels. Countries say one thing, do exactly the opposite. Australia, for example, signed the agreement, but soon after the signing of the agreement, it withdrew. And ECOLA, which is Australian Council of Learned Academies, it criticized its own government by saying that the Australian government has absolutely acted in absolute selfishness. They did not mince any words. So one has to go into that. It's available on the net. You can download ECOLA's reports on migration, on diaspora, on smart engagement with Asia, and so on. So Asian century, they talked about and want to have, shake hands with Asia. But what comes when it comes to implementation, it comes to a knot. So that's where, one has to call the bluff of the so-called pretensions of multilateral negotiations. That I think is absolutely important. So I hope the IMRF would be different from them. I would like to, on your behalf, thank both our speakers, Raz Bordule, who has left, and Ms. Naidu. I suppose she is still with us. And I would thank all the people who have asked questions and all those who have just listened. I think sometimes listening is much more difficult and more important than speaking. So thank you to all of you. And I think we have still not finished. We will have one more session where we will talk about the intercompact relationship between refugees and migrants, and that would be on next Tuesday. So with this, please allow me to close this session. I have noted some of the logistics problems that people have shared, participants have shared. They were expecting the end of term questions and they have not been yet shared with you, and I will take your concern to the relevant people in the who are managing this affair, and then we'll get back to you. We have had some constraints in sharing the questions earlier, but the details are not important. What is important that the questions should reach you very soon. So with these words, I thank you all once again.
Thank you very much, moderator and participants, and it was really enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you. Up next, I will give me more time to talk. I have a lot of things
Yes,
to say,
of
to share.
Yes, yes, all the time that you have.
Thank you. You are well done. Joseph Commanderia.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Dr. Binod.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Grace.
And we're waiting for a
Bye-bye.
question, sir.
Yes, yes. I am not the
Thank
right person to answer that, but I will convey this to the right person.
Okay. Thank you, classmates. Thank you, Dr. Binod.
Thank you.
Good night. God bless.
Panelists.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Panelists.